It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors. And I've no intention. Now I've started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this. Terrible.
Camilla expected another private royal briefing. Instead, one sentence changed the atmosphere of the room completely. Before her lay a sealed inheritance confirmation bearing a name she had never expected to stand alone: Princess Charlotte. Diana's most personal collection of jewels, pieces carrying memories the monarchy had spent decades trying to contain, had been assigned to one granddaughter, and Camilla's stunned silence revealed just how deeply the decision had landed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla lowered the page, removed her glasses, and looked across the table at Charles without speaking. The sealed inheritance instrument, a legal document naming who would ultimately receive protected family assets, confirmed Charlotte as the sole future heir to Diana's private jewel vault. No other royal claimant would share ownership. Charles watched her hand settle beside the paper. These were not the crown jewels, which belonged to the monarchy and pass with the crown. They were Diana's privately controlled pieces, jewels bound to family memory rather than royal office. That distinction made Charlotte's inheritance personal. She was not simply receiving diamonds, sapphires, and pearls. She was inheriting a connection to a grandmother whose memory still shaped William. Camilla felt that difference immediately. The queen consort had spent years building her place beside Charles, yet rank offered no influence here. Charlotte had been given something no title could manufacture: a direct line to Diana's legacy. For a woman who had lived beside that memory, the meaning was impossible to ignore. William faced his own shock when the confirmation reached him. The prince had known that an arrangement involving his mother's collection existed, but a documented family account presented that morning showed that even he had never been told the structure. Charlotte alone would eventually receive everything held inside the protected archive. Nothing would be divided. Nothing would be redirected through another royal household. Then Charles opened the second sealed page. The language was even more decisive. Marriage could not alter the destination. A changing royal title could not alter it. Palace preference could not alter it. The arrangement had been designed years earlier to survive future shifts in status, influence, and family power. Camilla slowly placed the confirmation flat on the table. She said nothing. Charles remained silent as well, but both now understood that the decision had not begun that morning. Someone had prepared for this long before Charlotte's name appeared on the page. But to understand why Charlotte's name carried such devastating weight in that room, the palace first had to confront what Diana still represented to every person sitting around that table. This was never merely about diamonds. Charlotte had inherited a story before she was old enough to understand its wounds. Catherine had spent years protecting that story without trying to possess it, and Camilla had spent decades living beside its shadow. Now those three lives had collided through Diana's jewels, turning a private inheritance into something painfully personal for a family that had never completely escaped its past. William carried that truth more heavily than anyone. Through him, Charlotte stood in a direct line to Diana, not through royal office, not through marriage, but through family. That difference mattered. Catherine would only serve as guardian of the collection, meaning she would protect the pieces until her daughter reached the age and conditions set out in the inheritance arrangement. She could safeguard them, but they were never meant to become hers. William sat with Catherine in private and tried to explain what the confirmation had done to him. Pride came first. His daughter had been trusted with something deeply personal. Then grief followed almost immediately. The prince looked toward a photograph of his mother, stopped halfway through his sentence, and rested his fingers against the frame. He quietly admitted that seeing Charlotte's name beside Diana's possessions made him feel as though one chapter of his mother's life was moving into another generation. Catherine understood exactly why that frightened him. She had spent years trying to make sure memory never became pressure. She told William that Charlotte should one day understand who her grandmother was, without feeling responsible for repairing everything that had happened before she was born. The future queen-in-waiting had already received private instructions concerning several pieces, but those directions had come with strict limits. She had been told how to protect them, yet she had been forbidden from explaining where the full collection would ultimately go. Camilla was carrying a very different pain. The queen consort now understood that no amount of rank could give her a place inside this inheritance. Diana's jewels followed blood and family memory, not ceremonial authority. For someone who had spent decades living beside comparisons with the late princess, that distinction cut more deeply than any palace rule could have done. Charlotte, meanwhile, knew almost none of this. William and Catherine had deliberately kept the scale of the inheritance from her. They wanted childhood to come before legacy, and love to come before obligation. The jewels would wait, but the secrecy had a beginning. Years earlier, one argument over a single piece from Diana's collection had convinced the family that protection was no longer enough. They needed something stronger. And that promise, to separate Diana's memory from the battles surrounding her, began after one private incident the family would later remember as the moment everything changed. Years before Charlotte's name appeared on that final document, a single necklace had already exposed the danger. What began as a quiet discussion before a family memorial gathering turned into a confrontation over who had the right to control Diana's personal legacy. No cameras recorded it, no official statement followed, but one sentence spoken that evening convinced William that his mother's belongings needed protection stronger than royal courtesy. William had already grown uneasy about how the collection was being handled. Several of Diana's privately owned pieces remained under coordinated palace stewardship, meaning officials helped manage their storage, movement, and ceremonial use, even though they were not crown property. To the prince, that distinction mattered deeply. These jewels were not symbols of state. They were pieces of his mother's private life, and he increasingly believed they should never drift into institutional control simply because they carried royal history. The tension finally broke before a memorial reception at Kensington Palace. Camilla asked whether a sapphire necklace closely associated with Diana could be temporarily included in a wider royal heritage presentation. She framed it as a respectful gesture, part of an effort to show continuity across generations. William heard something very different. To him, the necklace was being treated like an object the monarchy could borrow to soften its own complicated history. William closed the case with both hands. His answer came immediately. The piece would not leave the family collection. Camilla held his gaze, surprised by the force of the refusal, while the prince made it clear that his mother's belongings were not to be used as props for reconciliation, image, or ceremony. The disagreement ended quickly, but the resentment did not. Charles faced the consequences minutes later. William spoke to him privately and admitted that the exchange had changed his thinking. The king listened as his son explained that simple courtesy was no longer enough. If every future decision depended on goodwill, then one disagreement, one marriage, or one change in palace priorities could scatter the collection forever. Catherine offered the solution that gave the idea shape. She told William that dividing the jewels among several future descendants might seem fair, but fairness could eventually destroy the story connecting them. Keeping the collection intact under one eventual heir would preserve both memory and meaning. From that point, the prince began working with family trustees to build a restrictive inheritance structure around the entire archive. Camilla would not understand the full consequence until years later. When she finally learned that this old confrontation had helped lead directly to Charlotte's sole heir status, the queen consort stopped accepting explanations through staff. She wanted William himself. The argument had been buried, but not forgotten, and when its consequences finally returned, Camilla wanted the one answer only William could give her. When Camilla finally entered the room with William, there were no advisors between them and no ceremony to soften the conversation. She did not begin with Charlotte. She began with herself. Had this inheritance been designed simply to protect Diana's jewels, or had it been constructed specifically to make certain that the queen consort could never touch them? William's answer would wound her, but not for the reason she expected. Camilla placed the document between them and kept her voice controlled. This arrangement concerned Diana's personal estate, meaning privately owned family property, rather than assets tied to the crown or the monarch's official duties. That distinction was exactly why William had agreed to meet her face to face. He wanted no courtier translating his meaning, and no palace office turning a family matter into an institutional dispute. Camilla pushed the paper toward him. Was this protection, or was this always meant to keep me outside? The question landed harder than the document itself. William did not reach for the page. He left it untouched and answered her directly. The prince said the structure had never been created to punish another woman. It had been created so Diana's grandchildren would never have to negotiate, compete, or ask permission for pieces that belonged to their own family history. William kept his tone steady, but the memory behind it was unmistakable. He had watched uncertainty surround his mother's belongings for years, and he refused to let the same tension reach Charlotte. One eventual custodian would keep the collection intact. No competing households, no divided claims, no future argument over which descendant deserved which piece. The young princess had been selected because the arrangement was designed to preserve the vault as one complete inheritance. Camilla's anger shifted when another detail emerged. Catherine had no ownership claim either. She could safeguard certain pieces and, where permitted, wear them temporarily on her daughter's behalf, but they would never become hers. Every designated jewel would ultimately return to Charlotte. The queen consort leaned back and studied William differently. For the first time, she understood that Catherine had not been elevated over her. Both women had been deliberately placed outside permanent ownership. The real beneficiary was Charlotte, and the real purpose was continuity. But that answer created a deeper problem. Camilla knew palace preferences could change. Kings could change. Family relationships could change. Yet this arrangement appeared capable of surviving all of them. She looked again at the document and asked the question William had been waiting for. Who had the power to make it untouchable? And the answer was bigger than either woman's influence, because the real power behind Charlotte's inheritance had been hidden inside the structure of the agreement itself. The most consequential line was not Charlotte's name. It was the clause underneath it. Buried inside the inheritance framework was a restriction designed to survive changing monarchs, marriages, titles, and palace loyalties. Charles could advise. William could protect. Catherine could safeguard. But none of them could simply rewrite Diana's final family legacy once the conditions were activated. Suddenly, the silence surrounding the document made perfect sense. Charles read the clause alone before calling William back into the room. The arrangement was built around a private family trust, a legal structure that placed the collection in the hands of trustees who were required to preserve it for one named beneficiary. That meant the monarch could not simply take control because he was king. Charlotte stood at the end of the arrangement as sole eventual owner, while Catherine's role remained temporary. She could protect selected pieces until her daughter reached the age and conditions written into the trust, but she could not claim them for herself. Charles reached for his pen, as if he intended to mark the page. Then he stopped. The king understood the weight of what he was reading, because Diana's possessions had always carried more than financial value. They carried unresolved history. They connected William to his mother, Charlotte to a grandmother she never knew, and the monarchy itself to a chapter it could never fully escape. Charles closed the file without making a single mark. When William entered, He admitted that perhaps Diana's belongings deserved something the royal system rarely gave its own past: complete freedom from present politics. The prince listened carefully. For years, he had feared that rank, marriage, or shifting alliances might eventually turn his mother's collection into another source of dispute. Now the structure prevented exactly that. William then pointed to the strongest restriction. A non-diversion condition meant the jewels could not be permanently transferred to a spouse, another royal household, an exhibition collection, or any unrelated institution. Temporary use was possible under strict conditions, but ownership could not drift elsewhere. Catherine faced the same limit. If she wore one of the designated pieces for an important family occasion, it remained Charlotte's future property. Every item had to return to the protected collection afterward. No temporary appearance could become permanent possession. Charles finally understood why the agreement had been built with such precision. It did not trust future harmony. It planned for future conflict. And once the small circle allowed to read those restrictions understood what they meant, palace routines began changing almost immediately. Camilla was about to discover that the consequences were no longer theoretical. The document could no longer be changed easily. Now the people around it had to change instead. The fallout began with something almost painfully small. No announcement echoed through the palace corridors. No confrontation erupted before staff. Instead, a jewelry consultation disappeared from Camilla's schedule. A storage authorization changed hands, and one locked cabinet was quietly reassigned to Catherine's custodial office. For the Queen Consort, the message was unmistakable. Charlotte's future inheritance was already reshaping the present. Camilla opened the revised briefing folder and noticed the change almost immediately. Her name had been removed from an upcoming consultation concerning Diana's private collection. The new custodial structure meant that administrative control over those pieces now followed Charlotte's inheritance arrangement rather than ordinary palace access. It did not affect the wider royal jewelry holdings, but that distinction offered little comfort. The restriction was narrow, yet deeply personal. Camilla read the page twice before looking toward Charles. "Why was I not told?" she asked quietly. The king tried to steady the moment, explaining that the change was procedural and limited only to the protected collection. But she closed the folder and left it untouched. Procedure, she told him, could still make someone feel as though a door had been closed directly in their face. Charles understood the hurt beneath her restraint. He knew she was not losing her entire position or ceremonial standing. She was losing access to one specific part of royal family history, and that history happened to belong to the woman whose memory had followed their marriage for years. That made the change feel heavier than any administrative adjustment should have felt. Catherine reacted very differently when the new inventory authority reached her. She told William immediately that there would be no language of victory around it. The future queen-in-waiting understood that safeguarding Charlotte's inheritance was a responsibility, not a prize. She did not want Camilla humiliated, and she refused to let the arrangement become another contest between two women connected to Diana in very different ways. William then received another surprise. Among the protected records was one final sealed packet, addressed for Charlotte alone. A documented family instruction stated that it could not be opened until she reached the age set by the trust. The prince knew only that it contained guidance connected to Diana and the collection. Even he was not permitted to read it. Camilla's anger had not disappeared, but something inside it was beginning to shift. The exclusions now seemed less personal than she had first believed. And before resentment could harden again, Catherine asked to speak with her alone. The palace had explained the rules, but only one person could explain what those rules were meant to protect. And Catherine chose to do it without witnesses. There were no secretaries, no lawyers, and no king in the room when Catherine finally spoke to Camilla alone. For the first time since Charlotte's inheritance became known, The conversation stopped being about clauses and authority. Catherine did not defend herself because she had gained nothing personally. Instead, she explained the promise behind the arrangement. One day Charlotte should receive Diana's jewels without inheriting the bitterness that once surrounded them. Catherine closed the door herself and sat opposite Camilla, with no papers between them. She wanted the conversation stripped of every layer of palace language. Her custodial role existed only until Charlotte could responsibly control the collection herself, and she made that clear from the beginning. The arrangement did not change rank inside the royal family, nor did it give her new ownership. It simply placed temporary responsibility in her hands until the young princess was ready. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then the queen consort admitted what had been driving her anger from the start. She had seen Charlotte's inheritance as another comparison with Diana, another reminder that no matter how many years passed, the late princess would still be placed beside her in the public imagination. That wound was older than the document. It was why the exclusion had felt personal before she fully understood it. Catherine did not dismiss that pain. She leaned forward and answered with something far simpler. Charlotte, she said, must never be forced to choose between respecting the living members of her family and loving the grandmother she never met. The future queen-in-waiting wanted the inheritance to carry memory, not resentment. Then she added the sentence that changed the conversation completely. This cannot become another fight she inherits from us. Catherine then revealed, through the private conversation itself, that she had personally supported the clause, preventing her from ever becoming permanent owner of the collection. She had wanted that restriction written clearly, so nobody could accuse her of using Diana's memory to strengthen her own place. The jewels would pass through her hands, but never become hers. Camilla finally saw the structure differently. Charlotte's sole heir status was not a weapon aimed at one woman. It was a firewall against future rivalry, designed to stop marriages, titles, and competing households from tearing the collection apart. For the first time, the tension between them eased. But peace inside that room came just as the story escaped beyond it. Inside the room, the temperature had finally fallen. But beyond those walls, Charlotte's name was already becoming a national headline. By morning, the private arrangement had become a public symbol. Britain was no longer debating only who owned a collection of jewels. People were talking about Diana, Charlotte, memory, inheritance, and a family attempting to pass something precious forward without passing its old wounds with it. Then one newspaper front page appeared across London, and a single photograph transformed an internal royal decision into an unmistakable generational moment. Palace communications moved quickly but carefully. The broad arrangement was confirmed. Charlotte would eventually receive Diana's protected private collection, while Catherine would serve only as custodian during her daughter's youth. That distinction mattered, because the jewels were separate from the crown jewels, which belonged to the monarchy itself. This was not a transfer of constitutional property. It was a family inheritance, and the public understood the emotional difference immediately. William watched the coverage in private and felt the story become painfully personal. A broadcaster placed old footage of Diana beside a recent image of Charlotte, drawing attention to the same quiet expressions people believed they could see across generations. The prince stared at the screen longer than he intended. Then he reached for the remote, turned the television off, and remained seated in silence before returning to his family. Camilla saw the same coverage and made a different choice. The queen consort did not issue a complaint, challenge the framing, or ask staff to push back against comparisons with Diana. For the first time since the inheritance became known, she allowed the story to stand without treating Charlotte as a rival. That silence carried more meaning than any official response could have done. Outside Victoria Station, one fictional morning edition captured the mood completely. Its front page read, "Diana's legacy passes to Charlotte," with photographs of grandmother and granddaughter at similar ages printed beneath the headline. Commuters stopped to look. Some smiled. Others simply stared at the two faces side by side. Near Kensington Palace, the emotion became more personal. People began leaving flowers and handwritten notes connected to Diana's memory. One message stood out because of its simplicity. "Keep the memories safe for her." The words spread quickly through coverage, and suddenly, the argument over ownership felt smaller than the meaning people had attached to the inheritance. William heard about the note later that day. He understood what the public had decided. They were not celebrating a victory over Camilla. They were seeing continuity. And that left one final responsibility inside the family. The country had decided what Charlotte represented. Now her family had to decide what legacy they would actually place in her hands. In the end, the vault mattered less than the promise surrounding it. Charlotte would inherit diamonds, sapphires, pearls, and pieces carrying the unmistakable memory of a grandmother she never knew. But William and Catherine understood that the true inheritance could not be locked behind steel. It was the responsibility to remember Diana without weaponizing her, to honor the past without reopening every wound, and to carry history forward without becoming trapped inside it. Charlotte's place in the arrangement now stood beyond dispute. She remained the sole eventual heir to Diana's protected private collection, while Catherine would continue safeguarding the pieces until every condition of the trust had been fulfilled. The structure had survived questions, resentment, and palace tension because it was built around one simple purpose: preserving the collection intact for the person chosen to receive it. Charles accepted that truth quietly. The king understood that this was a private family legacy, separate from his authority as monarch, and that distinction finally removed the last possibility of intervention. He no longer saw the arrangement as something requiring correction. He saw it as something that needed to be respected. William felt the change most deeply when he spoke with Catherine alone. The prince admitted that he had once feared his mother's belongings would keep creating conflict long after her death. Every jewel seemed capable of reopening an old argument. Now, for the first time, he believed those pieces might reach Charlotte without carrying the same burden. Camilla reached her own conclusion later with Charles. The queen consort acknowledged that Charlotte receiving Diana's belongings did not weaken her own place. It simply protected a relationship that belonged to another part of the family. That acceptance did not erase the past, but it ended the need to compete with it. Catherine placed the inheritance confirmation back inside its protective case, beside the unopened letter reserved for Charlotte. She did not touch the letter. The future queen-in-waiting understood that some memories belonged to the future, and opening them too soon would turn inheritance into pressure. William watched her secure the document and rested his hand gently over hers. When Charlotte was ready, he said, they would explain everything, not as a royal controversy, not as a fight over jewels, as a story about her grandmother. The collection would remain together, no scattered pieces, no divided meaning. Charlotte would inherit the full story. And that was the real meaning of Diana's jewel vault. Not wealth passing from one princess to another, but a wounded chapter of royal history finally becoming a family memory instead of a family battle. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.